So my name is Anmol. I am the chief data scientist over at Livongo, which is in digital health. I know we have the afternoon session and we have about a 45-minute time slot, so lots of conversation. Um, Feel free to use this as a venue to ask questions or really make this interactive. If it's just me speaking for 40 minutes, that'd be pretty boring. So, so hopefully we can have a dialogue, and if you have perspectives, I'd love to hear them. So I'm going to talk about what we do at Livongo with applied health signals. So we consider ourselves an applied health signals company, and the way we use data to understand our members and to understand and support them and drive better outcomes in healthcare. And I'll actually spend some time on specific examples of how machine learning plays a role in our business every day. So that's going to be the bulk of our presentation. But I'll spend a little bit of time before that introducing Livongo and just giving you a sense of what's happening in healthcare. So can you raise your hand if you're from the healthcare space or digital health? So are most people from that background? And can you raise your hand if you have absolutely no healthcare background and you're like, this is cool? All right, great. So we have a mix. So we'll do a little bit of introductions. So this is not a surprise, but I think we all get this, that machine learning has changed our world, right? So the very left picture is what a self-driving car sees when it's out on the highway. That's from an example from Uber. And the other end of the extreme is what your voice looks like to a system that's trying to identify voice agents, in this case, for example, Alexa, right? But perhaps the biggest frontier of machine learning and data science that's relatively untapped today is what's happening in healthcare, and particularly what's happening in digital health. And so for those of you who don't know or haven't been tracking this closely, there's about 147 million people just in the US who live with one or more chronic conditions. And so the top 5 chronic conditions, diabetes, heart disease, behavioral health, back pain or chronic pain, or some of these conditions that you've heard of. And they're very expensive for our healthcare system, right? So healthcare, we spend about 18% of our GDP is healthcare spend, and close to a majority, close to 90% of that is actually managing these chronic conditions, right? So if you think of the economic impact of bringing in data and bringing in algorithms and bringing in machine learning into this industry, it's really, really big in terms of how much of a shift you can have. And frankly, especially as we talk about healthcare in this year, it's probably the only way we scale access to healthcare, both in this country and globally, which is, I don't think we're going to scale access to care by training new doctors and having a huge human services component. It's going to be by using data and machine learning in novel and innovative ways, and we'll talk about that. And so what does Livongo do? So we provide solutions across most of these chronic conditions, which help people lead better lives and empower people to lead better lives. And so that involves, we build our own hardware. And so if you're a person who's living with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, we have our own blood glucose meters that are cellular connected, that interface directly with the cloud. We provide, obviously, our software services. And so this the software to help you, digital coaching to help you manage your condition, change your behaviors, get that support. And then on the other extreme end, we also provide clinical and coaching services. So we have coaches and connections back to your doctor that we can plug it all together so we can make sure you get complete support across all of those. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So today we have products in 5 key areas. So diabetes is our flagship product, which you've probably heard about, so type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Hypertension, which is people living with high blood pressure and often people on medications in hypertension. Weight management and diabetes prevention. And so a lot of people are in the pre-diabetes phase and are getting support using Livongo. And then most recently in behavioral health. So behavioral health is stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, people managing all of these. And as I mentioned earlier, and you'll see this as we talk more about the data and the models we build, a lot of these conditions coexist, right? So you'll have people who have multiple conditions, and so they're managing their diabetes and their hypertension, or they're also clinically diagnosed with depression, and so we're helping people with these multiple chronic conditions, get the support that they need. And that's an important part of how we think about a person. And then, this is what's unique about healthcare for anybody here who has a product today selling in healthcare or is thinking about starting a company is you have to be very data driven, not just for your member experience or your consumer experience, but also for your economic outcomes and your clinical outcomes. And so what that means is, it's very easy to build a healthcare product that a lot of people like, but doesn't get them better, right? So it's a completely different bar when you're now investing in clinical trials, in academic publications, in a body of evidence that also proves that in addition to being a good product in a high NPS and lots of engagement, that actually you're demonstrating in long-term sustained clinical improvement in a person. Right? And that's been a big differentiator for us at Livongo. And you'll see that in the way we're interfacing our clinical expertise and the way we publish with some of the machine learning and data science pieces that run on our production systems, right? So tying those two together is really important in healthcare. And the other challenge, and often if you're measuring outcomes, is it's a multi-year process, right? So like you might take year 2, year 3 to really show that these are sustained outcomes, especially for a condition like diabetes or weight management and so on. And then economic ROI is also really important, right? You want to build solutions which show that people are, that clients are saving money. In our case, the clients are employers or health plans, but clients could also be consumers for certain other companies that you're thinking of starting. And so the core of what powers all of this, and we'll cover this in more detail, and so I want to give you some introduction to the company. The core that powers all of this is what we call our core engine, our AI engine, as our team calls it. And this is about collecting data from all the different sources that we spoke about. So sources where we, different surface areas for where we interact with a consumer, we interact with a member, using different kinds of models to understand what's happening in those situations, and then providing feedback and driving behavior change in those areas in a sustainable manner, right? So what's unique about Livongo is we control the closed loop, the full system, right? And the closed loop being, often you'll find companies will analyze data, they'll predict something from it, but they don't have a way to actuate and change the product experience in a healthcare setting. And we have the ability, because of the member base that we have, that we can change what shows up on their blood glucose meter. We can change what shows up in their mobile app. We can actually guide a clinician or coach who's working with them to do something different based on what a model predicted, and then iterate that rapidly over, in the course of multiple weeks or engineering sprints. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So if you think of Livongo, everything we're doing, sort of now that you know what the business is and what the company does, everything we're doing is effectively a machine learning problem. It's an AI or a data science problem, right? And so we'll talk about some of these in more detail, but it starts with stratifying people when they get on our system, right? One of the things we've all learned is every person's different, and so personalization is really important. And so how do you understand the risk profiles, the needs that a person has, or what's most likely to work for them? And so stratification becomes really important from the moment people come onto our system. It starts with, for us, enrollment is a huge driver of our success. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Enrollment being when we sign a contract with a client. Let's say we sign with a health plan. Today we have 22 health plans, over 800 employers who offer Livongo, and many of them Fortune 500 employers. When we sign one of those contracts, we're on the hook for getting people to sign up and understand and use Livongo. So targeting and driving enrollment becomes really important for us. Behavior change is critical in any chronic condition management. If you think of what happens in a chronic condition, like 99.9% of the change you want to make is actually happening outside a doctor's office, right? It's happening when you're standing in line and you choose to grab the salad instead of the cookie, right? It happens when you take that extra time and you go work out. That's key to managing a lot of chronic conditions. And so finding ways in which we can drive behavior change in a way that works for a person is really one of our biggest advantages as a company. It's one of the biggest areas why we're able to drive the outcomes that you saw, the clinical outcomes and the economic ROI in the previous slide. Healthcare is by definition a human services model historically, right? That's not our approach, but if you look at historically, even today, 97% of the spend in our healthcare system, on the provider side, essentially you're paying doctors, right? It's a fee-for-service system. You're paying for people, right? And again, so how do you then get really, really good at figuring out where can you drive behavior change using digital means or digital coaching, and where do you have to connect a person to a human, and how do you best set those intersection points up is also really interesting. And then so we'll talk about some of those examples as well. So any questions about Livongo? Any comments so far before I jump into some more details? Anything here that's surprising?
So the diabetes machine, you sell the diabetes machine?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we don't sell we don't sell the diabetes meter, right? We actually, our business model is we charge a per participant per month price. And so these are, if you're a health plan, for example, you may have people who end up in the emergency room. Maybe they have a lot of visits with their doctor. So instead of those costs, you pay us a per participant price. And effectively within that price for whoever is using it that month, that's all we collect. Everything's included in that. So it includes the hardware, it includes the coaching services, it includes all the machine learning components, it's all included. So we don't sell any of the individual pieces. We actually carry the risk on people getting better, and that's kind of how we're paid.
So another question is that different people use different kind of diabetes meter.
Right.
So suppose I use one company, some other person is using another company's diabetes meter. How this system integrated those information?
Yeah, so we have some capabilities that we're working on to integrate with other diabetes solutions. So we have our own hardware. We also offer you, if it, free strips, so you don't have to pay for any supplies, which becomes a cost factor. But we also have some solutions to integrate if you have a diabetes meter or perhaps a CGM that you're using. So continuous blood glucose meters are new kinds of diabetes meters that you stick on. So we have some solutions to integrate and bring those data in.
Right now you don't have those integrations?
We have some. We've announced different things publicly, but we have some work we're doing with CGMs. Yeah, yeah. Our customer is so the company is designed for consumers. So we don't call them patients. We call them members, right? And so it's designed for consumers at the center. So we're a consumer product company. We are paid by an employer or by a health plan, and so they're the client. And that's partly because of just the nature of how our healthcare system is set up in the U.S. It's not the consumer paying for healthcare; it's some other entity that's paying for healthcare.
So any individual cannot do that, cannot subscribe or anything.
Today we don't have a model where today you get it through your employer. And so we have a large percentage of Fortune 500 companies that offer us as a benefit. We have about 22 or so national plans that offer us as a benefit. We have a number of government opportunities. So most recently we announced a partnership with the Federal Employees Program. So that's, everybody who's a federal employee, that wellness plan, you have that benefit. It's about 5 million people in the US. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some examples of what we deliver here, right? So I spoke a lot about behavior change, and so the engine that drives behavior change, we call that health nudges. And the reason we call it nudges is we're not giving you this like jarring, like do something different. We're kind of gently edging you onto the path of making better decisions. Like that's the spirit of it, right? So let me give you an example of what that means. So this is our blood glucose meter, right? So it's a meter that you get when you sign up for Livongo. And because it's cellular connected, we have the ability to send you messages on the blood glucose meter that are personalized to what's happening in your life right now, right? So we can understand all the different variables in your life and send you those messages. So these messages, we have hundreds of different possible messages that are personalized. Now this one here that you see is an example of checking your blood glucose before breakfast, right? So it's one of the ones that we often talk about. And so for us, like not only do we build these systems, but we also show long-term sustained behavior change, right? So for example, with this particular nudge, 40% of people who completed this nudge actually started following this behavior. And what's even more important is like months later, a subset of them were following this behavior. So when you think of this as one surface area, one message, that's the impact it has, and think of sort of how we have to then multiply and cascade those probabilities, right? I'll give you another example of how we drive behavior change, and then we'll talk about the engine that powers the system on the back end, right? So this is an example of what we ship on our mobile devices. So if you have a blood glucose meter, you also have a mobile app that goes with it. It's called 5-day programs, right? So 5-day programs are these like small bite-sized programs that help you drive certain behavior changes that are core to sort of improving your outcomes, right? So it could be eating healthier, it could be exercising, it could be doing all these different actions, checking on a regular basis. Um, and so this is work that we recently published where we're actually showing at the Society of Behavioral Medicine, we're actually showing that these 5-day programs are driving a significant improvement, which is that second graph that you can see there, in actually the number of days or the number of blood glucose checks that a person has. And so in diabetes management, like checking behavior is highly correlated with long-term HbA1c control, right? And so we're driving an increase in checking behavior. And then ultimately that sort of also tracks on your mean blood glucose, where this particular feature, again, and we'll talk about how it runs in the background, but this is an example of when we say health nudges, if we talk about driving these targeted behavior changes, is building the clinical evidence to show that not only do we deliver them on the device, but it's actually driving clinical outcomes in a meaningful manner. That's a question there.
Besides diabetes, what are the other conditions where a blood glucometer would be extremely useful from a tracking perspective? Like, are you tracking things in oncology, cardiology?
Yeah, so we're not tracking anything in oncology. We have a product in hypertension, which starts to get at heart disease, right? For hypertension, blood pressure data is actually much more important and relevant than the blood glucose data that we're talking about here. We have a different device. So what happens in that case is you have two devices. So you'll have a blood glucose device where we measure blood glucose, and then you'll have a blood pressure cuff, which is also cellular connected. And actually, we announced an Alexa integration at some point earlier this year, which also allows you to sort of measure blood pressure, and we can combine those readings on the back end.
So you mentioned that again, some people has blood glucose is higher.
Right.
Is this your AI and ML can give you the A1C based on those blood glucose?
That's right, yeah. So we use an algorithm for estimated A1C, but that's actually still an input into all the other modeling that we do. But the estimated A1C and showing an improvement in estimated A1C is part of what we're talking about here. Right. So let's talk about, so let's go back to we're at AWS Summit, right? We're talking about Amazon. So how do we actually run this on the back end? And so as you see, and for those of you who are coming here from other consumer companies or SaaS companies, on the back end, we're essentially think of this as a flexible infrastructure that allows us to take all these different data points, right? So it would be the blood pressure data, it could be information about the content you've been clicking on, and apply different types of classifiers or different kinds of models with different objective functions in a production environment, right? And so, for example, one of the approaches we use is a segmentation-based model, right? So, segmentation-based model is saying, okay, we know people with this clinical range or these sets of inputs need this kind of support, right? And so that's based on a lot of expertise that's in the minds of clinicians on our team, and we've essentially programmatically use that to create models that put you on a journey or that put you on a pathway where we think here's what a doctor would do. But there are other models that are not necessarily structured in that manner. So a collaborative filtering approach, for example, is something that's very similar to what you might see in consumer sort of ad tech or Netflix or Amazon and the other products, right? So very well understood approach in those areas. And then the other axis for us is what's the objective function, and then matching across these different objective functions. So, for those, if you're not familiar with the idea, the objective function is actually what are you trying to maximize? And depending on what you maximize, you can get basically different results with the same kind of model. So the collaborative filtering models are really good for maximizing engagement with future content, right? So if you're trying to get a person to sort of really engage with their mobile content or the content we're sending them on the nudges, on the blood glucose meter that I showed earlier, then that's very similar to getting people to click on what product to buy on Amazon.com, right? Or what movie to click on Netflix. But if you're trying to drive a reward function that is based on checking behavior, that usually would work well with a lot of the enforcement learning kinds of problems that you've seen outside this industry. Right? And so just to double click into that a little bit more, we have a group here at Livongo that's really been thinking about efficient reinforcement learning as applied to healthcare applications. And so as you've probably heard, this is an upcoming sort of interesting area it's received a lot of recent attention in the machine learning community, particularly with OpenAI and AlphaGo and some of these other initiatives. And so if you're a self-driving car company, or if you're, OpenAI, you can basically write something that plays 43,000 hours of StarCraft, and then eventually you get enough data that you can get good at predicting, and having a model play StarCraft, right? So you have the ability to create these large data sets in those environments, right? Or if you're a cruise, you can put 600 cars on the road, and all of them have cameras and LiDAR sensors, and you're collecting this data. If you're working in healthcare, you don't have that luxury, right? If I send you like 6 messages a day, you're going to uninstall Livongo's app, right? Like you have a very high bar. And so if you're thinking of new classes of models like this particular approach, efficient learning becomes really important, right? And so there's a team that's been looking at, and they probably will, they're sort of in the process of publishing some of the work. And so Emma Brunskill, who's one of the collaborators here, is actually faculty at Stanford who works in this area. Is the team's been looking at different ways in which we can apply efficient approaches to reinforcement learning. So learning from, say, existing data and taking advantage of that in order to be able to use these models for healthcare applications more effectively, where you're constrained by how much you can simulate the data. So that's an example on some of the behavior change. Another part of behavior change that's really interesting and high value is actually medications, right? So for most people in these chronic conditions, medications play a really important role in driving the outcome. For something like hypertension, 80-90% of the people who are managing their hypertension are also on medications, right? And so medications, A, are expensive, but B, for many conditions, also are really complicated, right? So for behavioral health, for example, it can take 3, 4, 5 tries to get the right medication match for a person. Often people are sent on to medications because there isn't a better alternative. Maybe they aren't access to resources. And so I think, and these are like 4, 5, 6 week periods, right? So it's like a period of 6 months where people are trying to find the right medication, right? And so a lot of our thinking goes into how do we then take advantage of these data and the medication history that we have from you and all the information to understand what is the right set of medications for you, or how could we help optimize that process. So it starts very simply with actually understanding what are the points of friction in medications, right? So for example, this graph here at the bottom shows the distribution of different medications in our member base. This graph here shows the people sort of split between first line, second line, third line therapies. And so first line being things that you probably start off with. Third line, you've tried a couple of things, you're now on to a different regimen, right? So it starts with, for all of our members, understanding what role do medications play, and then using that information and using some of the other data that we have at predicting actually who's likely, as a first step, who's likely actually not to adhere to their medications, right? So like this graph that you see in the center is actually predicting like what's the likelihood of a person actually not being adherent to their medications, right? So you're identifying the barriers that get in the way of a person taking their medication. And so this is interesting because like it's the first step in saying, okay, this medication is not a good match, right? Then there's the next step of identifying what are the right medications for that person, how do you optimize medications, but this is like the first step in that exercise. And then you can also take this into different ways to actually then start to reduce the friction. So if you think of the behavior change problem we're solving is you're maximizing a function that's essentially helping people make better decisions, right? So you're minimizing friction in their lives. And so with that framework, so this is an example of something we launched with a subset of our customers, which is actually a benefit that reduces your co-pay component for any medications that you're on. So it's removing the friction, the financial friction that might exist on medications. Often in chronic condition management, there are many sources of friction. So in this case, it's financial. For some people, food choices are challenging. There may be other factors that get in the way. And so in this particular example, what you see is there is a bump in people sort of being more compliant with their blood glucose checking behavior, which we're using, as I mentioned, is highly correlated with long-term management of your blood glucose. There's a bump there for people where we turned on this sort of treatment, right? This benefit, and a pretty noticeable bump. And you see that also that it's much more for generic diabetes medications versus branded medications, right? So again, this is an example of taking those insights about what's a friction point, creating a new capability. This isn't even a product feature, it's actually a service, right? It's actually something that we offer that's more than a product feature, launching it and then showing that, hey, this is actually driving an improvement in people's outcomes and allows us to get people better faster and keep them healthier, right? So empowers them to lead better lives. Yeah.
Question on this slide. So you said that like the machine learned from the like what is the better suit for some treatment. So do you have any kind of like life scientist or pharmacist working with you?
Yeah, so we have a pretty strong clinical team, and so our chief medical officer, Dr. Bimal Shah, and I, and our chief product officer work really closely when we think of these. And so there's a team of experts that are basically MDs, people with sort of those backgrounds who are part of the Livongo team. Um, I'll take this to a different direction. So we spoke about scaling services and scaling coaching, right? So as an example, so Livongo runs 5 different kinds of coaching solutions, right? And so we have a coaching platform for diabetes, we have one for pre-diabetes, we have a different one for behavioral health, and so we staff hundreds of coaches who are available and help you sort of figure out, right? So and coaches play an important role in driving behavior change because coaches can guide you and help you sort of build those habits and work on those skills. But the key here, this example is using data to start to understand, well, who really benefits from coaching and who really needs coaching, right? So it starts from thinking of this from a system perspective. So this graph here is, so we have one of our coaching lines is called DRS, so Diabetes Response Specialists. And so if you have a hypoglycemic event, which is your blood glucose is outside a certain band, let's say at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, within 120 seconds, someone's going to reach out to you and make sure you're okay, right? And they might stay on the phone if, let's say, we have to get an ambulance over or help you with whatever the next steps are, right? So there's an emergency sort of the 24/7 support team that's there that is part of Livongo. So part of what we did was we started to use data about these members to understand what are the differences between people who trigger alerts on coaching and those who don't trigger alerts on coaching. Like what is a characteristic? So for example, like looking at mean BG value or looking at using insulin as like inputs into what drives the likelihood that this person is actually going to trigger an alert, so we put them on a different path, right? So it's like looking at the data, learning from those examples, and building that model. And then once you do that, you actually get really good at predicting when people are going to alert, right? So think of it, we're running a human services kind of like virtual hospital, right, for the lack of a better example, which is hundreds of people. And so if we can actually predict when people are going to walk in the door, in this case, trigger an alert, except it's like 2 a.m. on a Saturday, we can then staff and build a system that's much more scalable and much more efficient than anything else you see in the healthcare system, right? We want to help people where they need help and when they need help, not build a system that starts at 8 a.m. and shuts down at 4 p.m. Like that's not our philosophy. That's sort of a traditional way of thinking in healthcare. And so what this is showing is actually Profit, which is one of the sort of forecasting libraries, but there's many different ways to do this, is actually showing you our ability to then take into account the predictors that you saw on the previous slide, so the things that identify a person who's likely to need coaching, matching that with a variety of other variables like when people are signing new accounts and when we launch big deals and so on, and predicting when people are going to trigger alerts. Right? So the black dots are historical training data, and the red dot are actually predicted data, sort of what happened in real life, so our testing mix, right? And so you see that we've gotten really, really good at essentially predicting when people are going to call these coaches, right? And that can happen on a variety of modalities. It happens on the phone, it can happen through chat in the app, it can happen through other modalities as well. and there's a structure on a weekly basis. There's also a structure on a daily basis, right? So the graph below there is showing you a 24-hour view of the same problem. And what I mean by that is you can see like, there's a lot of structure that you then take into account. So you're predicting not just week by week, but within the week, hour by hour, when you should be staffing these facilities. And today, these are used in production. They're used in practice. They're used to staff our clinical and coaching services, and have driven a tremendous amount of commercial efficiency. And in fact, you can hear Lee, our CFO, talk about it in our last earnings call, where he just spoke about the impact this has had on the business in helping us run more efficiently. I want to keep digging deeper into some of this stuff. So this is one of our projects. We're working really closely with the Amazon team. And so if you think of what's happening in these coaching conversations that I spoke about, there's thousands and thousands of hours of essentially two people talking, right? And so if we understand what people talk about, what are their friction points, we can then design better product features, and we can connect the link back over to how we support them, right? So what you're seeing at the bottom is essentially what happens in, what is a transcribed coaching conversation, right? So that's taking essentially our audio files and running them through AWS Transcribe. And then this can go be used in a variety of natural language processing, modeling approaches and tasks, so we can then think about, how do we actually support this person better, or draw insights at a population level about what's going on, right? So an example here is, so it turns out when we go run these models, so this is a off-the-shelf sort of topic modeling approach we're using here, is you essentially get clusters of conversations, right? So people talk about certain clusters or certain areas or topics of conversation. So you get, in this example, you see 9 different topics that are expressed across these thousands of conversations. And you see, some people talk about support, some people talk about exercise, and so you can see the combination of food and pressure and stress. Some people talk about medications. And so what that tells us is 2 things. It tells us like, hey, this is what's important to this person, and it also gives us perspective on how to change what's needed for them. So if a person comes and talks about exercise consistently, we can then use that to say, okay, you know what, one of the levers for Anmol is actually going to be exercise. We're not going to get him to eat healthier, but we're going to get him to work out more. We have, under the hood, we use a latent preferences approach for some of these. So for those of you who come from ad tech, if I go to Google and I search, mechanic for an Audi A4, right? Google knows at some point that I have an Audi A4, right? So you're essentially taking those queries and you're inferring latent preferences about the person or about the member. And so we use these approaches in a similar manner to infer, hey, what's important to this person? We find that some people are more likely to work in certain areas, but not likely to work in other areas. Right? And so then you can extend this forward, and then you can figure out, which of these are correlated with, with sentiment, as well as with follow-up scores, right? So we build models that say, okay, these variables or these combinations of topics, a person's more likely to follow up, or these combinations of topics, a person's more likely to have a positive experience. So when you come and talk about exercise, you're positive. When you come and talk about stress, you're more likely to be negative. So we have to think about how we target them and support them differently. And these are just 2 examples of, a very rich library of understanding that's been driven by taking these human conversations that were previously impossible to sort of understand, running them through a digital interface, and then really understanding what's happening on the other side for these examples. I'll give you 1 or 2 more examples before I wrap up. So another area you heard me talk about was enrollment, right? And so as I mentioned earlier, like our core business is we're driving enrollment in the sense that where once we work with a client, we're responsible for messaging and communicating. And I also think this is a really important step because it sets the tone for the conversation when a person signs up. Like, how do they connect with Livongo? How do they form a perception? Their onboarding plays a huge role in that. And so if you've probably seen, if you've been tracking, some of this externally, is there's been a movement towards machine learning sort of experimentation platforms. Most of these are contextual bandit kind of approaches that are being used. And so Uber has one that they've publicly sort of shared. Netflix has one. Adobe has one. So there's quite a few of these, sort of experimentation ML platforms that you've seen sort of come about. And so part of our approach here is, again, to build on top of what we do with our Amazon stack and actually drive experimentation for member communications using these approaches, right? So for us, like this is where a model is essentially learning, what are the messages or the content or the media that are likely to resonate across these different distributions or different slices of people in different age groups and genders and geographies and zip codes, using a variety of data that we have when people sign up and they start sharing that information with us to personalize how we target them in their enrollment. And again, this is something where it's sort of in production or in working with our marketing teams and working with our growth teams, and really embedded where the work that they're doing day to day is actually taking advantage of these models on the back end and driving that forward.
So you say you have like a Apple platform like a Google has it. You do it.
Yeah, so we have one for enrollment that we've been working on internally. We don't. It's not for public use. It's our internal platform. Yeah. Yeah.
So you guys are going to publish for the
I think that's a good question. So the question is, are we going to publish it publicly? I was having this conversation earlier with some of the folks from Amazon, and the question is, do we publish these and build these, or do these become part of the stack and something you get with services like I think Pinpoint and others, right? And I think the need for these is definitely existing.
already published for the
Yeah.
open. Anybody can analyze
Yeah.
that data.
Yeah.
So it's like I think you should have the similar kind of thing,
Yeah.
which is specifically to the healthcare.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think there's a lot of nuance to experimentation in healthcare and so some of that. Yeah, and ours is I'd say still early compared to some of the work that Uber's published for sure. Yeah, you can't really have a conversation about healthcare and data without talking about privacy, and I think particularly in the recent climate, this is a really important topic I think for all of us to keep in mind. And for us at Livongo, our approach is really simple, right? We're at the core consumer, a member-centric company, and so at the core, members have complete control of our data, and we have to get, we share data only if you ask us to share it, for example, with your doctor or any other resource that you want us to send it to. Go ahead. Cool. So. Yeah, and so I think this is what I had in terms of content. I'm happy to double click on any of these. It's been an exciting ride for us over at Livongo. This has been a busy year. So for those who haven't been tracking, we went public, over the summer. So in July, I think we're the first digital health IPO to happen, and so it's been a busy ride. But I think the reason this is also exciting is we're seeing a lot of problems firsthand, whether it's the enrollment or behavior change or scaling of clinical services or building models that tie all the way back to clinical outcomes and building a body of evidence that I think are going to be important challenges or problems for anybody in digital health, for any companies that are scaling in a commercial setting. And so if you have more questions or if you have thoughts for us, I'd love to sort of hear them. But yeah, that's all I had in terms of content. Cool.